The saloon went quiet the moment Harlan Tuck opened his mouth. Marcella Gentry stood at the center of the room with her back straight and her chin lifted, though everything inside her was fracturing like old clay in a summer drought. She had learned a long time ago that the moment you showed a wound in a place like Cobre Flats, New Mexico, in the year of our Lord 1883, the vultures would circle before you had even stopped breathing. So she stood straight. She stood still. And she let the words wash over her like dirty water she would scrub off later, alone, behind the locked door of the room she rented above the seamstress shop. Harlan Tuck was a broad man with a jaw like the butt of a rifle and a mouth that had never once been shut by consequence. He was the largest landowner in the territory east of the Rio Grande, and because of that fact, the people of Cobre Flats had always let him speak without correction. He stood now with one boot propped on the brass railing of the bar, his hat pushed back on his head, and his thick finger pointed directly at Marcella as though she were a mare he was appraising at auction. "She took $20 from my foreman," Harlan said to the room, not to her. He was performing. She understood that. He had always been performing. Took it right out of his vest pocket while he was sleeping. That is what kind of woman she is. That is what we have been tolerating in this town. A ripple of murmuring moved through the crowd. Marcella recognized faces in that crowd. Mrs. Patton from the dress shop where she bought her thread. Old Silas Morrow who ran the feed and grain. The Delgado brothers who had hired her to keep accounts for their cattle operation and who had told her, just 3 weeks ago, that she was the finest bookkeeper they had ever employed. All of those people were now looking at her with expressions ranging from uncertainty to quiet judgment, and not one of them had said a single word in her defense. She opened her mouth. She closed it again. What was there to say? She had not stolen anything. She had never stolen anything in her 26 years of living, but she had also learned that the truth, in the absence of anyone willing to carry it forward, was just words falling on dirt. It was Deputy Fen Crowley who laughed first, a sharp, humorless sound like a boot heel on stone. He was leaning against the wall beside the door, arms crossed, watching the spectacle with something close to entertainment. He was supposed to represent the law in this room. He did not move, and then the door at the back of the saloon opened, not loudly, not dramatically. It simply opened, and the man who walked through it was the kind of man whose presence rearranged the temperature of a room without making any obvious effort to do so. United States Marshal Monroe Blackwell had been in Cobre Flats for exactly 6 days. He had taken his meals at the boarding house on Creosote Street. He had reviewed the outstanding warrants at the jail, and he had said very little to anyone. He was 32 years old, lean and dark-haired with a jaw that seemed to have been set in granite, and the Marshal's star on his chest caught the lamplight as he moved through the crowd with the unhurried pace of a man who had already decided something. He walked until he reached the open space at the center of the room. He stopped. He looked at Harlan Tuck for a long, measured moment, and then he rose to his full height, which was something that happened slowly, the way a storm builds before anyone quite realizes the sky has changed, and he spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Mr. Tuck," Monroe Blackwell said, "I am going to ask you to prove what you just said." The room went absolutely still. Because in Cobre Flats, New Mexico, in 1883, nobody had fought for Marcella Gentry's reputation until that moment. Not one single soul. Marcella had come to Cobre Flats 14 months before the night Harlan Tuck pointed his finger at her in the saloon. She had come from Abilene, Kansas, by way of a stagecoach that broke an axle twice, and a wagon she had hitched a ride on for the final stretch of road through the high desert. She had $31 sewn into the hem of her coat, a carpetbag with 2 dresses and a ledger book, and the kind of quiet determination that comes not from never having been broken, but from having been broken so many times that you understand bone can heal stronger than it was before if you set it right. She had grown up the daughter of a man named Gerald Gentry, who had been a salesman of patent medicines and a drinker of anything that held a proof, and a mother named Ruth who had died of fever when Marcella was 9 years old. Gerald Gentry had loved his daughter in the distracted, occasional way that certain fathers love their children, the way you love a plant you sometimes remember to water. He was not cruel. He was simply absent, and absence, Marcella had come to understand, leaves a specific kind of hunger that presence of any quality can sometimes fill in ways that are not good for a person. She had been engaged once at 20 to a man named Calvin Rourke who sold dry goods and had a pleasant smile, and who turned out to have 2 other similar arrangements going on simultaneously in 2 other Kansas towns. When that secret came to light, the people of that particular town had looked at Marcella the way people always seem to look at the woman in these situations, as though she had been the fool, as though she had done the deceiving, as though the shame belonged to her. She had packed her bag that same week and begun moving, and she had not stopped moving until Cobre Flats. What Cobre Flats had, which other towns she had passed through did not, was work. Real work, quantifiable work, the kind she was good at. Numbers, figures, the management of accounts and the keeping of records. She had a gift for it, a natural precision of mind that made the columns line up and the errors appear to her like spelling mistakes in a letter, obvious and correctable once you knew what you were looking at. The Delgado brothers had hired her within a week of her arrival, once she had sat down with their ledger books and shown them in 20 minutes where they had been losing $80 a quarter to a supplier overcharging them on delivery weights. After the Delgados, the word had spread, and she had quietly built herself a life in that town. A small, careful, self-constructed life, but hers. Harlan Tuck had wanted to hire her. She had turned him down. That was the center of it, though nobody in that saloon knew that part of the story on the night he pointed his finger at her. Harlan Tuck had approached her 6 months ago with a proposition that involved not just keeping his accounts but keeping his confidences, which was a different thing entirely. He had records, he told her, that needed to be maintained in a way that would not attract the attention of certain federal assessors. He had used the word arrangement. He had used the phrase mutually beneficial. He had said it all in the smooth, comfortable tone of a man who had never once been told no by someone who was afraid of him. Marcella had told him no. He had looked at her for a long time after that. He had smiled. And then he had said, very quietly, that he hoped she understood how things worked in Cobre Flats and that he genuinely hoped she would remain comfortable there. She had taken that for exactly what it was, and she had carried the knowledge of it inside her like a coal held against the chest, warming and burning simultaneously, for 6 months. She had told herself she was being careful. She had been waiting for the strike, and on the night it came she had not been entirely surprised, only exhausted, and very alone, until Monroe Blackwell spoke. He stood in that saloon with the lamplight on his face and his voice at its normal register, and he said, "Mr. Tuck, you have made a serious allegation against this woman in a public place. I am asking you, as a United States Marshal with jurisdiction in this territory, to produce your evidence." Harlan Tuck's face moved through several colors in quick succession. "My foreman told me what happened. That is my evidence." "Then let your foreman stand here and say so," Monroe said. "Let him stand in front of her and in front of witnesses and say what he says happened. Cole is not in town at the moment. Where is he? I do not know the precise location of my foreman at every hour of the day. Then you have made a public accusation against a woman based on the word of a man who is not present to be questioned," Monroe said, still quiet, still perfectly, terrifyingly quiet. "That is not evidence, Mr. Tuck. That is a rumor with a wealthy man behind it, which is a different thing entirely, though I understand they can look alike from certain angles." The silence in the saloon had taken on a physical quality, as though the air itself had thickened. Marcella was looking at Monroe Blackwell's profile, at the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his posture, and she was feeling something she had not felt in a very long time, something she did not quite have a name for yet, only that it was warm and startling, and arrive the way the first smell of rain does before you understand a storm is coming. Harlan Tuck said, "Marshal, I would be careful about whose business you are inserting yourself into in this town." Monroe turned then slowly and looked at Tuck directly. "Mr. Tuck," he said, "I am inserting myself into the business of federal law, which is the only business I am authorized to conduct and which happens to apply here. Now, you can produce your foreman with corroborating evidence and submit it to a proper hearing, or you can retract what you have said publicly and let this woman return to her work. Those are your choices this evening." Harlan Tuck had not been presented with choices in a very long time. The experience of it moved across his face like a weather system, turbulent and unpredictable, and the room watched him work through it. Every person in that saloon was calculating simultaneously, because that was what people in small towns did. They calculated what the powerful wanted, and they positioned themselves accordingly. But the Marshal's star had a power of its own, a federal one, and Harlan Tuck, whatever else he was also a man with records he did not want examined too closely. Monroe Blackwell, standing there in that particular stillness, looked exactly like the kind of man who would examine records. Harlan Tuck looked at Marcella with an expression that promised this was not finished, and then he looked back at the Marshal and he said, "Cole may have been mistaken." That was all he said. He finished his drink. He left. The room exhaled. People began talking in the low, murmuring way that follows the passing of a storm. Marcella stood for a moment in the center of it all, and she found that her hands were shaking slightly inside her gloves, not from fear but from the particular shock of having been defended when she had stopped expecting it. Monroe Blackwell walked toward her. He stopped at a respectful distance, a man who understood the architecture of space and its meanings, and he said, "Miss Gentry, I apologize that this happened in a public setting. Are you all right?" Marcella looked at him for a moment before she answered. She was calculating too, because she was a precise and careful person. She was asking herself who this man was and what he wanted, and whether the kindness was real or whether it was the kind that came with its own hidden invoice. "I am unharmed," she said carefully. "Thank you for what you did." "I did what the law requires," he said. Then he paused, and something in his face shifted in a way that was not official or lawful, just human. "I also did what seemed right. Those were the same thing tonight." She did not know what to say to that. She nodded once, and she left the saloon with her spine straight and her chin lifted, exactly as she had come in. And she did not let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened until she was inside her rented room with the door locked and her back against the wall and the quiet dark all around her. She sat down on the edge of her bed and she put her face in her hands, and she cried, briefly and efficiently, the way a woman cries who has been trained by circumstance to do it quickly and without witnesses. Then she washed her face in the ceramic basin on the stand beside the window, and she looked at herself in the small, slightly warped mirror above it, and she said very quietly to her own reflection, "He does not know you. Do not go building castles." But the warmth was still there. She could not quite put it out. Monroe Blackwell had come to Cobre Flats on assignment, but the assignment was not, as the locals imagined, primarily about the series of horse thefts that had been plaguing ranches along the eastern stretch of the territory. The horse thefts were real enough and they were part of his work, but the larger purpose, the one that existed in the sealed orders he had received from the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe, was an investigation into Harlan Tuck's operation and the specific question of whether he had been defrauding the federal government on land grant assessments and cattle weight tallies submitted for territorial taxation purposes. Someone had been submitting numbers that did not match reality, and the numbers had been catching up with Harlan Tuck for 3 years, slowly but with the particular inexorability of mathematics. Monroe had been chosen for this assignment partly because he was good at his work and partly because he was new to the territory and unknown to Tuck's network of informants. He had built his reputation over 8 years as a marshal operating primarily in Texas and the New Mexico territory, and that reputation rested on two things: his accuracy with a firearm, which was notable, and his patience, which was exceptional. He was the kind of investigator who could sit with incomplete information for weeks without forcing conclusions, which was a rarer quality than it sounded. He had noticed Marcella Gentry on his second day in Cobre Flats because she was the kind of person who was easy to notice if you were paying attention, which he always was, and yet somehow avoided the notice of people who were not. She was not loud. She did not demand rooms. She moved through the town with an efficiency and a self-containment that he recognized immediately as the product of long practice, someone who had learned to take up exactly the amount of space required and no more. He had seen her leave the Delgado brothers' office with a ledger under her arm and pause on the boardwalk to look at the sky in the way people do when they are thinking about something completely different from the sky. He had noted her face, which was serious and brown-eyed, and had the kind of structure that becomes more interesting the longer you look at it. He had noted her hands, which moved with the precise economy of someone accustomed to working. And then he had noted her in his mental ledger under the category of people worth understanding better, which was a category he maintained with professional rigor. What he had not expected was to learn, 2 days later from the territorial office clerk, that Marcella Gentry had turned down Harlan Tuck's offer of employment 6 months ago, and that Tuck had been running a quiet, sustained campaign of social erosion against her ever since. Small things, whispers, a word here, a suggestion there. The subtle, maddening kind of damage that leaves no single, identifiable wound, but accumulates into something that can destroy a person's standing in a community, without any single act being provably intentional. It was, Monroe recognized, a specific kind of cruelty, one that relied on the willingness of bystanders to carry the work forward, because gossip was self-perpetuating once it was set in motion. The night in the saloon had not been planned on his part. He had been passing through, following a lead on the horse theft case, and he had walked in to find Marcella Gentry standing alone in the middle of that crowd with Harlan Tuck performing for the gallery. He had made a decision in approximately 3 seconds, weighing the professional implications against the simple fact of what was right, and the simple fact had won without much contest. What he had not anticipated was the way she had looked at him afterward. That careful, assessing look, the look of someone who had learned to take the measure of a kindness before accepting it, who had been burned by apparent generosity often enough to treat it with the same caution you would treat a coal that might be hot or might be cold. You had to check before you gripped it. He respected that. He respected it enormously. He had met too many people who accepted apparent goodness at face value and paid for the naivety later, and the wariness in Marcella Gentry's eyes was not cynicism. It was intelligence. It was a woman who had kept herself whole in difficult circumstances by trusting carefully. He understood that kind of woman. He had grown up watching his mother be one. The morning after the incident in the saloon, Monroe arrived at the courthouse early and spent 3 hours with the land grant records. He was building a case, slowly and methodically, the way you build anything meant to hold weight. Around mid-morning, the clerk, a young man named Aldous Pike who was nervous and eager to please, brought him a cup of coffee and said, almost as an aside, that Miss Gentry usually came in on Thursday mornings to file the Delgado's weekly reports, and that today was Thursday. Monroe thanked him for the coffee and returned to his papers. But when the door opened 40 minutes later and Marcella Gentry came in with a leather folder under her arm, he looked up, and she met his eyes across the room, and there was a moment between them that had nothing to do with land grants or public accusations. It was just two people recognizing each other across a distance and understanding, perhaps before either of them was entirely ready to, that something had begun. She crossed to the clerk's window. She conducted her business with the precise efficiency he had expected. She was turning to leave when he stood up from the table and said, "Miss Gentry, "May I ask you something?" She turned. She waited. "Tuck approached you about handling his accounts," he said. "I know you declined." "I am not asking for confirmation. I am asking whether in the course of that conversation he showed you anything, documents, numbers, anything that struck you as irregular." She looked at him for a long moment, and he watched her process the question, felt her weighing not just the answer but the asking of it, who this man was and what he was building, and whether the secrets she was being asked to give would be used correctly. "He did not show me anything specific," she said finally. "He described what he needed in general terms. He needed someone who could make certain delivery tallies and land measurement records look consistent with each other when they were not." "Did he say that plainly?" "He said it in the way men like him say things plainly, which is not quite directly but in a way where the meaning is entirely clear and the words can be denied." Monroe nodded slowly. "That description is consistent with what I have been finding." "Are you building a case against him?" she asked. It was a direct question and he appreciated the directness. "I am doing my job," he said, which was not quite a yes and not quite a no, and she recognized it as such and nodded. "If he believed you were investigating him," she said carefully, "he would have reasons to want the people around him to appear unstable, unreliable, not credible as potential witnesses." The precision of that observation landed in Monroe like a key in a lock. He looked at her for a moment and said, "Yes, that is exactly right." Something shifted between them then, the recognition that they had been looking at the same thing from different sides of a wall, and that the wall had just become considerably thinner. "Miss Gentry," Monroe said, "I need to ask whether you would be willing to make a formal statement about the conversation you had with Tuck 6 months ago. It would be part of a sealed federal record." She did not answer immediately. The pause she took was not hesitation, it was thinking, and he let her think without filling the silence, which was one of his better qualities. "Will it be enough to protect me?" she asked. "Or will I give that statement and find myself with a larger problem than I have now?" "I cannot promise you that nothing will be difficult," he said honestly. "I can promise you that you will not be alone in it, and I can promise you that I will use every legal authority I have to ensure your safety." She studied him. "You have been here 6 days," she said. "Yes. And you are already making promises." "Yes. Why?" He considered that question with the same seriousness she had given it. "Because what happened last night was wrong," he said. "And because you were alone with it in a room full of people, and that told me something about how long it has been going on and how much of it you have been carrying. And because I happen to believe that the law exists to protect people who need protecting, and when it fails to do that, it is the obligation of the people who carry it to correct the failure." Marcella Gentry looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I will think about the statement." She left, and Monroe sat back down with his land grant records and found that the columns were considerably harder to concentrate on than they had been an hour ago. She thought about it for 2 days. During those 2 days, she went about her work with her usual precision. She balanced the Delgados' quarterly accounts, which showed a profit that pleased them both considerably. She took on a small additional job from the pharmacist, who needed his inventory tallied and his supplier costs reviewed. She ate her meals at the boarding house dining room, where she sat at the end of the long table and exchanged pleasantries with the other boarders and watched, from the corner of her eye, whether anyone was treating her differently after the incident in the saloon. Some were. The quality of the difference varied. Mrs. Patton from the dress shop was warmer, which surprised Marcella and which she chose to accept cautiously. Deputy Fen Crowley, who had stood against the wall and laughed, now avoided her gaze entirely, which she took as the specific discomfort of a man who has been caught behaving badly and lacks the character to acknowledge it. The Delgado brothers, the older one, Santiago, and the younger one, Rafael, had said nothing about the incident directly, but Santiago had, the morning after, set an additional $1 on top of her usual fee without explanation, and she had understood it as the kind of apology that did not know how to use words. On the evening of the second day, she was sitting in the small room above the seamstress shop working by lamplight on the pharmacist's inventory when she heard footsteps on the exterior stair. She went still. There was a knock, 2 knocks, measured and unhurried. She opened the door and Monroe Blackwell was standing on the narrow landing with his hat in his hand, and a look on his face that was entirely different from his official expression. He looked in that lamplight, younger somehow, and there was something uncertain in him that she had not seen before, something that did not fit neatly with the man who had stood in that saloon without raising his voice. "I apologize for the hour," he said. "I wanted to let you know that Cole Driscoll, Tuck's foreman, came back to town this afternoon." She felt herself tight. "And he has retracted the claim about the $20 entirely. Tuck apparently decided that drawing that kind of attention was not worth the cost." Monroe paused. "I may have made it clear during a conversation with Tuck this afternoon that any further attempts to damage your reputation would be treated as witness intimidation in a federal investigation, which carries specific and significant penalties." Marcella looked at him. "You told him I am a witness in your investigation." "I implied it strategically," Monroe said. "I did not confirm it directly. He does not know whether you have spoken to me, but he knows that if he moves against you, he moves against a federal proceeding, and that is a line he is not yet prepared to cross." She leaned against the door frame and she looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "Marshal Blackwell, you are doing a great deal for someone who is not officially your witness." "Yes," he said simply, "I am aware of that." The lamplight from inside the room fell across the landing between them, and in it she could see the details of his face that she had been cataloging in the private way that careful people catalog things they find interesting. The particular line at the corner of his mouth that deepened when he was being precise, the way his eyes were more green than brown in certain lights, the steadiness of his hands even when the rest of him, she was beginning to understand, was not entirely steady. "Would you like to come in?" she asked. Then, because she was a woman of precise instincts about the appropriate architecture of things, she added, "I can leave the door open. Mrs. Finch below is always awake at this hour." Monroe almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that did more to a person than a full one, because it was involuntary and therefore real. "I would not want to impose on your work. I would not have asked if I minded the imposition," she said. He came in. He sat in the chair by the window, the only other chair in the small room, and she sat at her work table, and the door remained open, and Mrs. Finch below was indeed awake. They could hear her moving around in a domestic, comfortable way that made the building feel inhabited and safe. The lamp burned between them and they talked, not about the investigation or Harlan Tuck or the formal proceedings that might or might not be coming, but about other things, about numbers and what she found beautiful in their precision, about the territory and how it was different from Texas, which he had known for most of his working life, about the stagecoach that had broken its axle twice, and the wagon driver who had talked about his sister in Albuquerque, for the entire final stretch of road, as though the talking was a form of navigation. About the moment when you arrive somewhere new, and cannot yet tell whether it will become home or whether it will be another in the long series of somewhere else's. Monroe told her, in the careful way of someone who is used to not telling people things, that he had been born in San Antonio to a father who had worked for the Postal Service and a mother who had kept accounts for a dry goods merchant, and that he had gone into law because he had seen, growing up, what the absence of it did to people who needed it, and had been given instead only the kind of authority that came from money or size. He did not make it dramatic. He stated it as fact. But the fact was a window, and she looked through it. She told him about Abilene and Calvin Rourke and the way the town had looked at her afterward. She had not told that story to anyone in Cobre Flats. She told it now in the same spare, factual way he had offered his own, and watched his face as he received it. "That is a specific kind of injustice," he said. "The kind that does not leave visible marks." "No," she agreed. "It does not. It does not mean you were foolish," he said. It means he was dishonest. Those are not the same thing, though certain people prefer to treat them as though they are. She looked at her hands on the table for a moment. Then she said, "You are a careful person." "I try to be, careful with words specifically." "Yes, I appreciate that," she said. "Imprecision in language causes most of the damage I have seen." He smiled at that, a real one this time, not the almost version. It changed his face considerably. She found that she needed to look at the pharmacist's inventory for a moment to recalibrate. He left when the clock at the church down the street rang 10, because that was the appropriate hour, and he understood the appropriate hour as a matter of both propriety and respect for her position in this community, which was still fragile and which needed to be treated carefully. He stood in the doorway with his hat back on his head and said, "Thank you for the conversation, Miss Gentry." "Thank you for the information," she said. "That was only the first part of why I came," he said. Then he appeared to decide that this was sufficient disclosure for one evening, put his hat properly on, and went down the stairs. Marcella closed the door and stood with her back against it in the same position she had stood the night of the saloon, but what she was feeling now was entirely different. It was not the brief, efficient grief of someone who had been humiliated and survived it. It was something lighter and more dangerous, the particular brightness of a feeling that you know can be taken away. She sat back down and looked at the pharmacist's inventory for a long time without seeing it. She gave her formal statement to Monroe 5 days later, in the courthouse, with Aldous Pike present as the recording clerk, and the door opened because Marcella Gentry understood the particular importance of visible propriety for a woman in her position in 1883. She told him exactly what Tuck had said to her, in the precise language she remembered it, with the dates and the location, the corner table of the hotel dining room where Tuck had bought her coffee she had not asked for, and explained what he needed in the particular vocabulary of a man accustomed to euphemism. Monroe recorded every word and asked clarifying questions with the methodical patience that was, she was coming to understand, his primary professional characteristic. He knew how to ask questions that opened information rather than closed it, questions that gave the person being asked room to think rather than walls to push against. Afterward, Aldous Pike left on an errand, and they sat for a moment in the quiet courthouse room with the late autumn light coming through the high windows, and Monroe said, "That statement, combined with what the federal assessor's office has already found, should be sufficient to bring this to a grand jury. Tuck will know, likely within the week, that there is a proceeding initiated." Marcella considered this. "What does that mean for the immediate situation?" "It means he becomes more unpredictable," Monroe said honestly. "Men like Tuck, when they understand that the legal consequences are real, sometimes make poor decisions. I want you to be aware of that and to tell me immediately if anything changes in his behavior toward you." "You are telling me to watch for a trap," she said. "I am telling you to be careful," he said, "which you already know how to be." "Better than most," she agreed. He looked at her with that direct, serious attention that she had stopped trying to interpret strategically and had simply begun allowing herself to feel. "Yes," he said, "better than most." The grand jury was convened 2 weeks later in Socorro, the county seat, and Monroe rode out for 3 days to present evidence. During those 3 days, Marcella kept her routine exactly as it was, accounts and ledgers, and the quiet mathematical satisfaction of numbers that balanced, and she told herself that the particular flatness of those 3 days had nothing to do with the absence of a specific man from the town she was standing in. She was not entirely convincing to herself. On the evening of his second day away, she was coming back from the Delgado's office in the early dark when a man stepped off the boardwalk in front of her. Cole Driscoll, Tuck's foreman. He was a narrow man with sun-cracked skin and the particular look of someone who has been doing someone else's dirty work long enough that it has begun to show on his face. "Miss Gentry," he said. She stopped. She kept her expression entirely level. "Mr. Driscoll." "Mr. Tuck wants you to know," Driscoll said very quietly, "that he has no quarrel with you personally, that this situation has gotten more complicated than it needed to be and that he believes it could be simplified. He said to tell you that a woman of your capabilities could find work in any number of places, and that Cobre Flats, specifically, might become less comfortable in the near future. Marcella looked at him for a long moment. She kept her voice completely steady. "Mr. Driscoll, please tell Mr. Tuck that I find Cobre Flats entirely comfortable, and please also tell him that I am aware his foreman retracted a public accusation against me under pressure, which is the kind of thing a federal official tends to find noteworthy." Driscoll's face did something complicated. "Miss Gentry, I would not be proud about that if I were you. The Marshal is going to leave eventually." "Marshals always do." "Good evening, Mr. Driscoll," she said, and walked past him with her spine straight. She went back to her room and sat very still for a long time. She was not afraid in the way that makes your hands shake. She was afraid in the deeper, more serious way that makes you think carefully about your position and what tools you have and what the next move actually is. She thought about what Driscoll had said. Marshals always leave. It was true. It was indisputably true. Monroe was here on assignment, and the assignment would end, and the star on his chest and the federal authority it carried would move to the next place that needed it, and she would still be here among the consequences of whatever had happened. She allowed herself to feel that fully. She thought it was important not to pretend that the dependency she had allowed to develop around this man's presence was not there, because pretending it away would not actually make it go away. It would just make it more dangerous. Then she thought about the statement she had given, sealed in the courthouse records, and about the grand jury now in session, and she thought that maybe the way to be less dependent on any single person's protection was to make the protection structural. To make the truth the thing that protected her, rather than the man who was temporarily holding it up. She picked up her pen and wrote a letter to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe that she had been composing in her head for 2 weeks. She laid out, in precise and formal language, the details of Harlan Tuck's approach and her refusal and the subsequent campaign of reputational damage and the public accusation in the saloon, and she described the intimidation delivered through Cole Driscoll that very evening. She dated it, signed it, folded it, and sealed it with wax. She would take it to the post office in the morning. Monroe came back from Soccer Row on the afternoon of the 3rd day and found her letter waiting for him at the boarding house, because she had also, somewhat impulsively but not without strategic logic, sent him a copy. He read it standing in the hallway outside his room before he had even put down his saddlebag, and then he stood there for a moment with the letter in his hand, and something in his expression that she would have read, if she had been there to see it, as a mixture of professional gravity and something considerably more personal. He came to her door 40 minutes later. She opened it before he knocked the second time, because she had been expecting him. "You wrote to Santa Fe," he said. "I did. And to me. You needed to know about Driscoll." He stepped inside, and this time the urgency was different from before. It had a sharpened edge. "Driscoll approaching you like that is obstruction of a federal proceeding," Monroe said. "That is a serious crime. I need your willingness to include that in a supplementary statement." "You will have it," she said. He looked at her. His expression was professionally serious and also something else, something that was working to remain professionally serious and finding it difficult. "Miss Gentry," he said, "you should also know that the grand jury returned a true bill this afternoon. Tuck has been indicted. He does not know it yet, but he will know within 2 days, and when he does, his options narrow considerably and his behavior may become more erratic. He will be arrested. I will be executing the warrant personally, likely day after tomorrow. I wanted to tell you before it became common knowledge." He paused. "I wanted you to feel, going into that you understood what was coming." She felt, looking at him, the particular quality of being seen by another person that is entirely different from being watched. Being watched had been the experience of her life in Cobre Flats for 14 months, people observing her, weighing her, fitting her into their categories and their suspicions. Being seen was Monroe Blackwell knowing that she needed to understand what was coming, not because she was fragile and required protection, but because she was a participant in this proceeding and was entitled to the information. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." "You wrote to Santa Fe independently," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost wonder. "Without being asked. You did not wait." "I have been waiting my whole life for circumstances to improve on their own initiative," she said. "It has a poor record as a strategy." He was looking at her with his full attention, and she could feel it, the way you can feel the warmth of a fire without looking directly at it. And she thought that this man was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her in a long time, not because he would hurt her but because he would not, and she was not entirely sure she knew what to do with the version of herself that was beginning to believe in that. "Monroe," she said, using his name for the first time. She watched it land on him, watched the small, involuntary shift in his face. "Yes," he said. "I would like it if you came to supper at the boarding house with me tonight," she said. Formally, so that people see it. He understood what she was saying. She was saying that she was choosing, publicly, to be associated with him, that she was using the small but real currency of her association with a federal marshal to reestablish the social standing that Tuck had been eroding, and she was doing it consciously and deliberately, which was entirely like her, and she was also, beneath that, simply asking him to have supper with her because she wanted him there. "Yes," he said. "I would like that very much." They walked to the boarding house together in the early evening, and the people on the boardwalk who saw them saw what she intended them to see, and the people at the long supper table who saw them take seats together saw it also. And by morning the story in Cobre Flats was a different story from the one Harlan Tuck had been writing, and that was what she had planned. But what she had not planned, and what she would have been reluctant to admit she could not have planned, was the conversation at that table. The way Monroe described the trial that had brought him originally to the law, a neighbor's farm seizure he had witnessed as a boy of 15, the foreclosure based on a fraudulent land measurement, the particular powerlessness of watching something unjust happen when you are too young to stop it, and the decision he had made in the aftermath to become, eventually, someone with the authority to stop it. The way he listened to Santiago Delgado described the cattle market in the way that made Santiago feel genuinely heard, which was its own skill. The way he caught her eye across the table when something amused him and did not look away immediately. She went asleep that night with a feeling in her chest that was warm and enormous and frightening in the specific way of things that you have stopped allowing yourself to hope for. Monroe arrested Harlan Tuck at 11 o'clock in the morning of November the 14th, 1883, in front of the Cobre Flats courthouse, with 2 territorial deputies present and Aldous Pike recording the proceeding in his careful hand. Tuck did not resist. He had known it was coming long enough to have composed his face into something like dignity, and he walked with Monroe to the jail without making a scene, because he was, underneath everything, calculating what could still be saved, and scenes would save nothing. Cole Driscoll was arrested the following morning on the separate charge of witness intimidation. He did not take this with the same dignity, and was vocally unhappy about it for the better part of an hour before he settled into the quiet misery of a man who has understood, finally, that he placed his loyalty in the wrong man. The day after the arrests, Cobre Flats was a different place. Not a radically different place. Towns do not transform overnight any more than people do. But the particular quality of the air had changed, the way it changes after a long pressure system finally breaks. People who had been watching Marcella with sideways eyes looked at her now with something closer to the straightforward. Mrs. Patton from the dress shop stopped her on the boardwalk and said, flatly and without excessive apology, that she was sorry for the way things had been, and that she hoped Marcella would continue to patronize the shop. Marcella thanked her with genuine warmth and without excessive graciousness, because Mrs. Patton deserved the gratitude but also needed to understand that the gratitude did not absolve the bystander behavior, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that she could hold both of those truths simultaneously. The Delgado brothers gave her a raise without being asked, which was the best kind. Monroe came to find her in the afternoon, after the paperwork of the arrests was complete, and they walked together outside of town on the road that ran east along the base of the low hills, because they both needed air that was not full of the business and observation of the town's main street. The November afternoon was clear and cold with the particular sharpness of high desert in autumn, the light a slanted gold on the pale grass and the brush. "The trial will be in Socorro," Monroe said. "Probably in the spring. You will likely be asked to testify." "I know. The statement you gave is solid. Your letter to Santa Fe establishes the intimidation independently. You handled this better than most people would have." "I had help," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him working toward something in the methodical way he worked toward everything. She let him. "I have been offered a position," he said finally. "The federal marshal's office in Santa Fe has asked me to consider a permanent posting to this district. It would mean staying in the territory rather than moving to the next assignment." Marcella kept walking. She was aware of the effort it took to keep her pace even and her expression neutral while she processed this. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "A permanent posting?" "I have been asking myself that question for the past week," he said. She looked at the hills. They were quiet and dry and very old, and they did not offer any advice. "What does the answer look like when you find it?" she asked. He stopped walking. She stopped a moment later and turned to look at him. He was standing in the middle of the road in the slanted gold light with his hat in his hand, which was a habit of his when he was speaking something that mattered, taking the hat off as though the formality of the covering was inappropriate for the moment. "It looks like staying," he said, "for reasons that are not entirely about the professional opportunity." She looked at him for a long time. The cold air moved between them and the hills were very still behind him, and she could feel, in the full intensity of that moment, every careful wall she had built over 26 years of learning that people do not stay, that arrangements described as permanent are provisional, that the kindness with no visible invoice is the kind that arrives later with the largest bill. She could feel all of that, and she made a choice, the way you make a deliberate choice rather than a reflexive one. She looked at the evidence. Monroe Blackwell had stood in a saloon and spoken without raising his voice for someone he barely knew. He had conducted his investigation without using her as a tool. He had told her the truth about the difficulty of what was coming rather than sheltering her from it. He had sat with her inventory ledgers and the story of Calvin Rourke and given her back, in the form of a precise and honest absolution, something she had not known she still needed. He had taken his hat off. She took a breath of the cold, high desert air. "Monroe," she said. "Yes. I would like it if you stayed," she said, "for reasons that are also not entirely about the professional opportunity." He crossed the distance between them in 3 unhurried steps, and he took both of her hands in his, and the quality of the silence around them was the kind that comes after a long, difficult thing has finally been said correctly. He did not kiss her then. He was a careful man, and they were both careful people, and the appropriate architecture of the moment was not the immediate but the sincere. He held her hands and he looked at her and he said, "I would like very much to court you properly if you will allow it." Something in Marcella Gentry that had been held very tightly for a very long time released, quietly, like a latch being lifted. "I will allow it," she said. Courting in Cobre Flats in November of 1883 looked like this. It looked like supper at the boarding house 3 evenings a week, with the other boarders present and Mrs. Finch, who ran the establishment, presiding with a comfortable and knowing smile. It looked like Sunday walks on the road east of town, where the hills were quiet and the conversation was not, because they turned out to have a great deal to say to each other once they were in the habit of saying it. It looked like Monroe sitting in the chair by her window on 2 evenings when the cold came in hard and fast, and they drank the bitter coffee from her small camp stove, and she showed him the particular error she had found in the pharmacist's accounts that had been losing him $11 a month for 2 years. He had looked at the ledger, and then looked at her with an expression that she was fairly certain she would remember for the rest of her life. It looked like the afternoon she went to the jail to review some of the Tuck documents Monroe needed her to authenticate, and Deputy Fenn Crowley, who had laughed in the saloon, was there, and could not quite make eye contact with her. And Monroe, without making anything of it, positioned himself at her shoulder in a way that was not threatening and not performative but simply present, and she felt that presence like something physical and grounding. It looked like the morning the first real snow came to Cobre Flats, early for the season, and she looked out her window at the thin white covering on the rooftops and the boardwalks and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was not looking at it alone. Monroe kissed her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in December, on the road east of town, in the cold, clear air with the hills behind them, and the town distant enough that they were, briefly, just two people with no professional proceedings or social architecture between them. He stopped walking and turned to face her and cupped her face in both his hands with a care that made her eyes sting, and kissed her once, gently and deliberately and without any uncertainty at all, the way he did everything that mattered. She kissed him back. She put her hand against his chest, over the Marshal's star, and felt the warmth of him through the coat and the badge and all the layers of the careful, competent, good man he was, and she thought, with the part of her mind that was always counting and measuring, that this was the most precisely right thing she had been able to add to a ledger in 26 years. "I love you," he said, very quietly after. Marcella had braced herself for many things in her life. She had braced herself for disappointment and accusation, and the specific loneliness of being misunderstood by everyone around her. She had not braced herself for this, for someone saying this particular thing in this particular tone in this particular air, and the tears that came were not the brief, efficient kind she was accustomed to. They were the other kind, the kind that come when something you had stopped believing in turns out to be real. "I love you," she said. "I did not expect to. I planned very carefully not to, you should know that," he laughed. It was a real laugh, a warm and full sound that she had not heard from him before, and it made him younger, and she thought that this was perhaps the true version of him that lived under the professional gravity, and she was very glad to be the one standing there when it surfaced. "I know," he said. "I watched you planning not to." She shook her head. "You were not supposed to be watching that closely." "I could not help it," he said. The trial of Harlan Tuck took place in Socorro in March of 1884, in the territorial courthouse, before a judge who had been specifically assigned from the federal circuit to ensure that local influence did not compromise the proceedings. Marcella testified on the second day, wearing her best dress and her spine at its straightest and her voice at its most precise, and she described every detail of the conversation with Tuck and the subsequent reputational campaign, and Cole Driscoll's visit in the dark, and the letter she had written to Santa Fe. And not one word of it was shaken under cross-examination, because not one word of it was anything other than the exact truth. Monroe was present for her testimony, seated at the federal marshal's table, and he watched her with the same steady attention he gave everything important. And when she stepped down from the witness stand and passed him, he met her eyes with an expression that was professional and controlled in every visible way, and that she could read, because she had learned to read him, as profound and unwavering pride. Harlan Tuck was convicted on 6 counts of federal fraud and 2 counts of obstruction. He received a sentence of 7 years in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, which was where certain things ended up that could not be contained within the territory. Cole Driscoll received 18 months for the witness intimidation and cooperating testimony, which had helped nail down 2 of the fraud counts, and was released eventually to go be someone else's problem somewhere far from New Mexico. The train back from Socorro to the junction, and then the stagecoach back to Cobre Flats, took most of 2 days. Monroe sat beside her for the journey, and they were, for the first time since the case had been an active proceeding, simply two people without a formal professional obligation between them, and the particular loosening of that felt like putting down something heavy you had been carrying so long you had forgotten the weight of it. He proposed to her on the second evening of the journey at the way station where they stopped for the night, with the stars very bright and cold above the desert, and the fire in the station's hearth visible through the window behind her. He did it with the same directness and lack of performance that characterized everything he did when it mattered. He said that he intended to accept the permanent posting to the district, that he had found in Cobre Flats something he had not been looking for and had not known was missing, and that he would very much like to spend the rest of his life with her if she was willing, and that he understood she had reasons to be cautious about permanence, and that he intended to spend as long as it took demonstrating that his was real. Marcella Gentry, who had been cautious her entire life and who had been right to be, looked at Monroe Blackwell in the firelight from the window and said yes without any further deliberation, because the ledger of him was fully balanced, and it came out to the same number every time she checked it. They were married in June of 1884 in the Cobre Flats Methodist Church, which was a small building that smelled of wood and candle wax and held approximately 60 people, all 60 of whom were present. Santiago and Rafael Delgado sat in the second row. Mrs. Patton from the dress shop, who had made Marcella's dress, a cream-colored lawn with blue trim that was both practical and beautiful in the way that Marcella liked her things, sat with her husband near the back. Aldous Pike was there, nervous and delighted as always. Even the pharmacist, whose account she had untangled, brought his wife and both of his children and sat in the middle rows looking pleased with himself for knowing someone who was having such a fine occasion. The ceremony was conducted by the Methodist minister, a quiet man named Reverend Hoyle who had been in Cobre Flats for 6 years, and who performed the service with warmth and without excessive length, which Marcella appreciated. Monroe said his vows in the same tone he used for everything that truly mattered, quiet and precise and entirely certain, and when she said hers, she felt none of the fear she had half expected to feel. She felt, instead, the particular steadiness of standing on ground that is actually solid rather than ground you have been hoping is solid. He kissed her in front of all 60 people, and the small congregation made a sound of collective approval, and she thought that she had never in her life stood in a room full of people and felt, so completely and without reservation, that she belonged exactly where she was. They lived in the house on the east side of Cobre Flats that Monroe had taken a lease on in February, a proper house with 4 rooms and a kitchen, and a small yard where she grew tomatoes and herbs in the summer. It had 2 desks, which she had insisted on and which Monroe had found entirely reasonable, hers in the front room where the light was good in the afternoon, and his in the side room where he kept the case files and the territorial law volumes. She continued her work for the Delgados and expanded it to include 2 additional businesses after the Tuck verdict improved Cobre Flats' reputation for reliable commerce. He continued his work for the federal marshal's office, which in a permanent posting meant less riding to distant counties, and more of the steady, grinding, unglamorous work of maintaining order in a community that was slowly becoming something rather than just surviving. He was home most evenings. That was the thing she had not understood before this was possible, the simple, daily reality of a person being home. In the fall of 1884, she told him she was expecting, and he received this information standing in the kitchen in his shirt sleeves with a cup of coffee in his hand, and the expression that moved across his face was one she kept in the part of her memory she returned to most often in the years that followed, because it was the most completely unguarded she had ever seen him, entirely open, without any of the careful professional gravity. Just a man who had been given something precious and was aware of exactly what it was. Their son was born in the spring of 1885. They named him Samuel for Monroe's father, and he arrived into the world with a voice that immediately made his presence known and a pair of hands that were, from the very first, his mother's hands, precise and grasping and interested in everything. Marcella sat in the rocking chair Monroe had made, badly and with great determination and eventual success, in the backyard over the course of 3 weeks before the birth, and she held Samuel in the afternoon light from the window, and she thought about all of the versions of this life she had not been able to imagine, all of the rooms she had sat in alone that had seemed, at the time, like the only rooms available to her. She thought about the night in the saloon and the particular stillness that had come over her when Monroe had spoken, when a voice at its normal register had cut through everything louder surrounding it, and she thought that perhaps that was what she had spent her life listening for without knowing it. Not someone who shouted, someone who was certain enough not to need to. Monroe came in from his office at the end of the day and found her in the rocking chair with Samuel sleeping against her shoulder, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at them, and then he crossed the room and sat on the arm of the chair and put his hand on the back of her neck very gently, and she leaned her head against him, and the house was quiet around them, and the evening was coming in through the windows, and it was, she thought, exactly what home felt like. She had simply not had the reference point before. Samuel grew into a boy who was loud and curious and learned to read early, which his mother taught him from the account ledgers, which gave him an unusual relationship with numbers for the rest of his life. He had Monroe's steadiness and Marcella's precision, and his own particular quality, a fearlessness that was neither of theirs, but that they recognized as something built by the safety he had grown up inside. The winter of 1886 brought a cold that lasted longer than any winter in recent memory, and also brought the news that the federal marshal's office was considering Monroe for a supervisory position in Santa Fe, which would mean leaving Cobre Flats. They sat with this news at the kitchen table for an evening and talked about it with the same directness they brought to everything. And Marcella said that Cobre Flats had been a beginning and that she was ready, if he was, for what came next, because she was not her address and he was not his posting, and the life they had built was portable in the ways that mattered. They moved to Santa Fe in March of 1887, which was a larger city and a more formal one, with a territorial capitol building and a government district, and a social architecture that was more stratified and more visible than anything in Cobre Flats. Marcella arrived with Samuel on her hip and her ledger books in the trunk, and the cream-colored lawn dress still in perfect condition, because she had maintained it carefully, and she walked into Santa Fe with the same spine she had walked into Cobre Flats with, straight and unapologetic, and with the significant addition of a marshal's wife on her social record, which opened certain doors, and a reputation for financial precision that preceded her through the territorial business community, which opened others. She built a formal accounting practice within her first year in Santa Fe. Not as someone's employee but as a principal, Marcella Blackwell, accounts and financial records, with an office on the second floor of a building on Palace Avenue with 2 windows, and a sign she had chosen herself, and a client list that grew steadily, and included, within 2 years, 3 territorial government offices that came to her because she was the best in the city at what she did. Monroe took the supervisory position and proved to be as good at leading other marshals as he was at being one himself, which surprised nobody who had actually worked with him, because the qualities that made him effective in the field, the patience and the precision and the willingness to give people the information they needed rather than the information that was comfortable, were exactly the qualities that made other people better at their work when he was guiding it. In the spring of 1888, their daughter arrived. They named her Clara Ruth, the second name for Marcella's mother, and she was born in the Santa Fe house with the midwife present and Monroe sitting outside the door, and being useless in the particular way that loving and helpless people are useless in circumstances they cannot improve by competence. When Clara Ruth arrived and cried her first announcement to the world, Monroe was allowed in, and he sat on the edge of the bed with Marcella leaning exhausted against the pillows, and Clara Ruth wrapped and placed in his arms. And he held his daughter with the same careful, certain hands he brought to everything and said, very quietly, "Hello, Clara." And Clara Ruth looked up at him with the unfocused, enormous-eyed attention of the newborn and appeared, in the way that newborns appear things that we map onto their expressionless faces, to find him entirely acceptable. Samuel, who was 3, and understood that something important had happened without entirely understanding what, stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, and regarded his sister with the particular suspicion of a firstborn presented with competition. Marcella held out her hand to him and he came and stood beside the bed and she said, "Samuel, this is Clara Ruth. She is going to want to follow you everywhere and you will find it annoying and you will love her regardless." Samuel considered this. "She is very small," he said. "You are also very small," Monroe told him. "I do not believe that," Samuel said, and Marcella laughed, which hurt, and Monroe laughed, and even Clara Ruth made a sound that was not a laugh but that served as one in the moment, and the Santa Fe house was full of it. The years in Santa Fe were good years. They were not uncomplicated years, because no years are, and the work Monroe did dealt with real danger and real injustice, and sometimes the full weight of a federal proceeding could absorb him entirely for weeks, and she could feel the distance it created, and she had learned to hold the distance without letting it become something else, and to tell him, when he came back to himself, what the distance had felt like, which was not a complaint but an accounting, a keeping of the record so that nothing went unacknowledged and unaddressed. He received those accountings with the same careful attention he gave everything she said, and he learned to tell her, during the difficult periods, what was happening inside the difficulty, even when he could not tell her the details of the work, which was its own kind of intimacy, the intimacy of trusting someone with your interior weather. She had hard weeks too. There were clients who underestimated her because she was a woman, which was no different from anything she had navigated before, and she handled it with the same spine and precision she had always used. There were social occasions in Santa Fe where the wife of the supervisor of the territorial marshal's office was expected to perform a kind of decorative social function that was entirely at odds with who she actually was, and Monroe made it clear, once and without fanfare, to the people who organized those occasions that his wife was not decorative, and that her professional standing was to be treated with the same respect as any other professionals in the room. And after the first time he said it, he rarely needed to say it again. In 1890, Monroe received a letter from the United States Marshal's main office in Washington that made him sit down at the kitchen table very quietly. He showed it to Marcella that evening after Samuel and Clara Ruth were in bed. It was an offer to join the office in Washington in a significant administrative capacity, which would mean leaving the West entirely. They sat with it for longer than they had sat with anything in the years they had been married, and the conversation was the most serious of all their serious conversations, because this one was about more than logistics. It was about who they were and what the life they had built was made of and how much of it was specific to place and how much was portable. Marcella said, finally, that she did not want to leave, that the West had been the place where she had found herself and found him, and that the land itself, the dry air and the enormous sky and the particular silence of the high desert, had become necessary to her in a way she did not want to give up. She said this carefully and without ultimatum, because she understood that Monroe had his own relationship with his calling, and that the offer from Washington was a genuine recognition of his work, and she wanted him to make the decision that was right, not the one that was easy. Monroe listened to all of it. Then he said that he agreed with her, and that the West was also where he had found what mattered most to him, and that the kind of work he was able to do here, the direct, tangible work of law in communities that were still being built, was the work he wanted to do, and that Washington, for all its significance, was not where he belonged. He wrote back to Washington thanking them and declining. He took Marcella's hand across the kitchen table and he said, "We stay." "We stay," she agreed. There was a particular joy in that, in the choice made freely toward the thing already held rather than the thing that might be available elsewhere. Marcella had spent her life moving, always moving, and the act of staying, of choosing Cobre Flats, and then Santa Fe and the high desert sky, and this man and these children and this life, was the bravest thing she had done in a very long time. In the years that followed, Samuel grew into a young man who studied law at the Territorial College in Albuquerque, which his mother had pushed him toward, and his father had quietly encouraged by discussing cases with him at the supper table from the time he was old enough to follow the logic. He came back to Santa Fe to practice, and spent a significant portion of his early career arguing for land rights for the Hispanic and Pueblo communities of the territory, work that made his father quietly proud and his mother openly so. Clara Ruth, who had indeed followed Samuel everywhere from the age of 2 onward, and who had, exactly as her mother predicted, been found annoying and loved regardless, grew into a young woman of ferocious intelligence and a personality that seemed to have taken the best and most concentrated elements of both her parents. She had Monroe's steadiness and Marcella's precision, and the full, specific stubbornness of someone who had grown up watching a woman run a successful business, and a man enforce the law with quiet authority, and had concluded from this evidence that there was no reason she could not do whatever she was inclined toward. She became a teacher at the Territorial School in Santa Fe, and then, after New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, one of the first women to be elected to a school board in the new state. Monroe retired from the Marshal service in 1900, at 49, with a record that filled several volumes in the federal archives, and a reputation that was spoken of by younger marshals in the particular reverent tone used for people who made the work look like what it was supposed to be. There was a ceremony in Santa Fe that he attended without enjoying, and at which he said a short speech that Marcella had helped him edit down from a longer one, because his instinct was toward thoroughness, and her instinct was toward precision, and together they usually found the right length. Retirement suited him better than she had expected, because he transferred his methodical attention to the land they had purchased outside Santa Fe in the early 1890s, a modest property with good soil and a clear view of the Jemez Mountains, and which he worked with the same patient competence he had brought to everything else. He grew things. He kept bees, which was something that had surprised her utterly and delighted her entirely. The vision of Monroe Blackwell in his canvas coat and hat tending hives in the afternoon sun, and the honey was, as she told him, the best argument for retirement she had encountered. Marcella continued her practice well into the new century. The professional landscape for women in business was changing, slowly and not without resistance, and she was both witness to that change and a participant in it. One of the early members of the Professional Women's Business Association that formed in Santa Fe in 1904, and a persistent, quiet voice in its advocacy for women's right to enter into legal contracts independently, which in New Mexico was still, in the early years of the century, limited in ways that she found professionally and personally infuriating. She and Monroe celebrated their 20th anniversary in June of 1904 in the garden of the Santa Fe house with Samuel and his wife, a composed and kind woman named Alyssa whom he had met at the college, and Clara Ruth, and a visiting colleague from Albuquerque who was clearly interested in Clara Ruth, in a way that Clara Ruth was managing with her characteristic directness. The table was set outside under the cottonwood trees that had grown considerably in the 15 years they had been in Santa Fe, and Monroe made a speech that was, by his standards, long, and by anyone else's standards, exactly right. He said that he had spent his professional life working to ensure that the law protected the people who needed protecting, and that the truest thing he knew about that work was that it was most necessary in the moments when nobody else would do it, and that he had understood this in the abstract for years before the night in a saloon in Cobre Flats when he had walked in on something and made a decision in 3 seconds that had turned out to be the best decision of his life, not because it had been heroic, because it had not been. It had simply been what was right and available to be done, but because the woman standing in the center of that room with her spine straight and her chin lifted had looked at him afterward with those serious, assessing, entirely beautiful brown eyes, and he had understood immediately that he was in significant difficulty. Marcella, sitting across the table from him in the summer evening light with her family around her, and the cottonwood leaves moving above them, and 20 years of the most precise and honest and completely unexpected happiness she had ever calculated sitting in her chest like a well-maintained ledger, looked at her husband and said, "You are being unusually romantic." "It is an anniversary," Monroe said. "I am allowed to be unusual." "You were not so different on a Tuesday in November," she said. "As I recall, no," he admitted. "I was not." Samuel raised his glass. Clara Ruth raised hers. Alyssa and the visiting colleague from Albuquerque raised theirs. The cottonwood trees moved in the summer evening, and the Jemez Mountains were a blue line against the sky, and Monroe Blackwell looked at Marcella Gentry Blackwell across the table with an expression that had not changed in its essential quality since the afternoon on the road east of Cobre Flats when he had taken his hat off and told her he intended to court her properly. She looked back at him with the same eyes she had always had, serious and brown, and not the slightest bit inclined toward the decorative, and she raised her glass. They went on from that anniversary into the years that the new century kept producing, steady and changing and full, the way years are when the life inside them is genuinely being lived. Monroe's bees produced honey that became locally known enough that a merchant in Santa Fe offered to sell it commercially, which Monroe declined because the bees were for him and not for the market, a distinction he found easy to make, and which Marcella understood as the same instinct that had made him a good lawman, the ability to know which work was yours and which was not, and to not conflate the two. She continued to take on clients well into her 50s, selectively and on her own terms, choosing the work that interested her and the businesses she believed in, and she wrote a small practical manual on financial record keeping that was used by the Territorial Business College for a number of years, and which bore her name on the cover, Marcella Gentry Blackwell, because she had always kept both and saw no reason to stop. Samuel and Alyssa had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who grew up calling their grandparents with a comfortable frequency that filled the Santa Fe house on holidays and certain Sundays, with a noise that Monroe navigated with the patient adaptability of a man who understood that some things were not to be controlled, only survived and enjoyed. The grandchildren adored him, particularly once they were old enough to understand that the quiet man with the bees had once been a federal marshal, which gave him, in their estimation, a legendary quality that he was careful not to encourage, and that Marcella was careful not to entirely discourage, because the stories were true, and the truth deserved to be carried forward. Clara Ruth eventually married her own someone, not the visiting colleague from Albuquerque, who turned out to be more interested in Clara Ruth's idea of him than in Clara Ruth herself, which she identified within 6 months with her characteristic precision and exited accordingly. She married a civil engineer named Thomas Vega, who built roads and bridges across the new state of New Mexico with the same thoroughness that Clara Ruth brought to everything around her. And they had 2 daughters who were, from their very earliest days, entirely their mother. The house on the property outside Santa Fe, the one with the bees and the good soil and the clear view of the Jemez Mountains, became, in the later years of Monroe and Marcella's life, the place where the family gathered most naturally, because it had the quality of a place that had been inhabited by love for long enough that the love had become part of the structure. Marcella kept a garden there that was productive and precise and entirely beautiful, and Monroe kept his bees and his books, and the old case files that he was occasionally asked to consult on by younger marshals, who had questions about the methods and precedents of the territorial period. They sat on the porch in the evenings, as people do in the later years of a life that has been well lived, and watched the mountains change color in the light, and talked about what they talked about, which was everything and also, sometimes, nothing at all, because they had been in each other's company for long enough that the silence was also a conversation. One evening, in the late autumn of a year that was already carrying the weight of much history, Marcella was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea and a copy of a ledger she was reviewing for the last client she had taken on, and Monroe came and sat beside her with his coffee and was quiet for a few minutes in the way he was quiet, fully and without restlessness. Then he said, "Do you remember what Driscoll said to you that night when he came to your door?" She looked up from the ledger. "Which part?" "Marshals always leave." She set the ledger down on her knee and looked at the mountains, which were going gold and rose in the evening light. "I remember," she said. "He was not wrong as a general rule," Monroe said. "No," she agreed, "he was not. I just happened to be the exception," he said. There was nothing self-congratulatory in it. It was just the same careful accounting she had always recognized in him, the straightforward record of what was true. "You were not the exception," she said. "You were the man who chose to be, which is different." He considered this in the way he considered things she said that required it. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." She put her hand over his on the arm of the chair, and they sat with the evening coming in over the mountains and the smell of the garden and the distant sound of the bees settling for the night. And the life they had built was around them in every direction, complete and whole, and by any accounting she knew how to do, immeasurably, precisely, exactly right. Nobody had been willing to fight for Marcella Gentry's reputation in that saloon. Not one person in a room full of people who had known her for 14 months. And then a man had risen slowly from where he stood and spoken without raising his voice, and the world had rearranged itself around that quiet, certain sound, and she had spent the rest of her life understanding that this was what love actually looked like when it was real. Not grand gestures performed for an audience, not the loud declaration or the dramatic rescue. Just someone, at the moment when it mattered, choosing to stand up and tell the truth and meaning it, and not stopping. She had been worth fighting for. She had always been worth fighting for. It had simply taken the right person to know it and to have the character, the particular quiet character of Monroe Blackwell, to say so. And he had stayed.